thank everybody for making your way here on a Friday evening to Here East, Olympic Park. It's great that so many people are here. I'm David Dougal. I'm the head of the Centre for Excellence in Media Practice and kind of bringing together this project really. And this evening's event is part of the research project funded by the United States Embassy in London, logo at the top, and supported by the UK Media Education Association. Importantly, the Media Education Association are paying for the wine. Very, very important partners. This evening's talks and discussions will be followed tomorrow by a set of focus group workshops with a group of journalists, library professionals, teachers and students. So this is part of a kind of bigger project we're working on. It would be interesting to know now, before the speakers begin, which groups people are representing. So if you could, I know that probably most of you will say, well, I'm in more than one of those categories. I'm not trying to pigeonhole you. If you would allow yourself to be pigeonholed, could you raise your hand if you see yourself as a teacher or academic? Thank you. Journalist or other kind of media professional?
I'll go with that.
Thank you. Student? And library professional. You may not have any tonight, we've definitely got some coming tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. Both this evening and tomorrow, the project brings together media literacy researchers from the UK and the US, and the focus is very much on dialogue between those stakeholder groups, as we've just described, and also the American and UK perspectives on media literacy. That was a big part of the project, as far as the funders are concerned. We have three speakers tonight, David Buckingham, Monica Bulger and Paul Michailidis. And then we'll be going into a panel discussion with two discussants, followed by Q&A from you guys. My job is just to chair, keep things at time, admin. You'll be pleased to know that's how I'm going to limit myself for this event. Importantly, we have a Twitter hashtag, and it'd be great if you could tweet to it, and it is hashtag FNVML. Fake news being media literacy. Hashtag FNVML. If you go there, you'll find there's already some posts. And there's also a link to the Facebook live stream, and that's really important if you want other people to know that we're streaming this. So if you go to the Twitter hash, you'll see it there. Please retweet it. And if you want to have a look at it later, it will be there. I think it stays there for a while. And helpers over here are filming. You've got information sheet and consent forms. The plan for this evening is that we'll only be filming this part of the room. But if you ask a question, it will pick up your voice, but it won't pick up your appearance. If you're here tomorrow, it's slightly different, but we'll come to that when we get to that point. I've also been asked to ensure that the speakers speak clearly and loudly enough for Facebook live stream. And also I'll be trying to keep people to time. So I think that's it from me. Pass over to David Buckingham. If you don't know David Buckingham, he is, how do you pronounce it? Emeritus Professor at Loughborough University, and also working with the Leverhulme Trust on a project which will be in America, starting soon. David's the author of too many books to even hold in your head or memorise, never mind a list, but he's written a lot of stuff on media education, childhood, youth and identity. And his blog, if you haven't seen it already, which is at davidbuckingham.net, is essential reading, I think, for anyone working in these fields. And includes your new project, Growing Up Modern. Is that only on your blog?
Yeah, it's on the website.
Yeah, which is fascinating, I think. And he has a book out later this year on a new manifesto for media education.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, thank you, and congratulations to all of you for finding this place. I've been having kind of anxiety all day that nobody would actually be able to find it, but you've done it, so congratulations. I've got 15 minutes, and I tend to talk for far too long, so I've decided to ask 4 questions, or make 4 points, and that means I've got about 3 minutes per point. So I will do my best. First question. It's a kind of rhetorical question, really. I have several reasons for asking this. I think it's probably about a couple of years now that this term fake news has been in circulation. I am deeply tired of it already. I think one reason why, and I thought it was important to start with a message from our sponsor. One reason why is that the term has been appropriated. So fake news has now become pretty much anything that anybody wants it to mean, and particularly anything that anybody happens to disagree with, or in this case, to see as negative about them. Donald Trump has been one leading example, but not the only one. And you can say what you like about Donald Trump, but I think one thing that he has done is actually to talk a lot about traditional media, not just social media, not just what some people are calling legacy media. So fake news is not just about social media. I think that's that argument is one that's come from the left and the right. So in the UK, people will probably be familiar with Media Lens, which is mounting, I think, these very good, sharp critiques, particularly of the liberal mainstream media, particularly the BBC, the Guardian, who they hate utterly. But on the other hand, you also have stuff like this. People may be less familiar with this, but coming more from the political right, this site called Biased BBC, which is all about, from a right-wing perspective, how the BBC is a sort of nest of liberals and Trotskyists. So a problem then, in a sense, that what is fake news, what counts as fake news, really depends on your perspective. I think that another big difficulty here is the assumption that this is an issue of either or. It's either fake or it's true. It's either fact or it's fiction. And I think this idea that when we're talking about fake news, we're trying to replace something that's fake with something that's real is a kind of abiding problem with the debate. And I think it's also one that poses some big challenges for teaching as well. I think it's often assumed that we can get to a point where we will achieve total accuracy, total truth, total objectivity. And I think media educators will know that, unfortunately, the issue is much more complicated and difficult than that. The whole issue of media representation is one that really needs to be dealt with in a much more complex and nuanced kind of way. It's not simply either or. I guess I would want to argue that fake news, if we want to use that term, is a symptom of bigger changes in the media environment. It's in terms of who gets the opportunity to speak, who we hear from, in terms of how people make money out of media. But it also is a symptom of bigger social and political changes, the rise of populism, the polarisation of political debate, inequalities of various kinds, a decline in trust in authority, the rise of conspiracy theory, and so on and so on. So I think it's really important to see this in a bigger context, and not to assume that fake news is the cause of all of those problems. It's often said, and I think this was actually Barack Obama's claim, that fake news was a threat to democracy. This is a statistic coming from, there was a good kind of high-level expert group on fake news. And the argument is that fake news is somehow undermining democracy. I guess I want to ask, well, isn't fake news actually a symptom of bigger problems with what we call democracy or with the political system? So fake news may be as much a symptom as a cause of these bigger problems. There's a danger always of blaming the messenger, but there's a sense, I think, that fake news might well be a distraction from some of these bigger and more difficult issues at stake. So if fake news is a problem term, then we have misinformation, disinformation. Maybe disinformation is a better term, it's somewhat broader, but for me the problem is that it still implies that there is something called information. So if we can get rid of the dis or the mis, then we will somehow arrive at truth. And again, I would want to argue just replacing the term is not enough. We need to be thinking about media more broadly than that. So let's try and frame our discussion more broadly. My second point really follows from that. I think we need to keep sight of a bigger picture here. So I think we all know that fake news is a longer term phenomenon. This is an image from the early 19th century. A story was circulated in the press about life on the moon, which was widely disseminated around the world. And we know there is a long history of this kind of stuff, you know, kind of wacky, in a sense, obviously fake news in the popular press, including in our own beloved popular press in the UK as well. But my point is that in a way this is a very small part of something much bigger. There is a bigger issue which is to do with media bias, media representation. We need to think more broadly about this. One of the key centres of this debate has been in the last few years how the press has represented Jeremy Corbyn as the new leader of the Labour Party, and I think some quite good research which has pointed to very systematic forms of bias, not just in the popular press, and in fact it's kind of obvious really to have images like this or this. Actually those forms of bias are also, so I'll come back, they're also there in the BBC, they're also in a lot of what we might think of as the quality press as well. So again, I think this illustrates that fake news isn't just about social media. It isn't about a random fringe of nutcases generating conspiracy theories. It's actually about the mainstream media as well. As I said, it's easy to demonstrate that with the popular press, but it's also about the quality press, and it's also about our politicians as well. It's not simply about how politics is represented, it's about how politicians themselves are using media, if the sign of a bus is media, which it probably is. I think the other point to make on this is that fake news is also an economic phenomenon. You've been aware of these stories about how a lot of the pro-Trump fake news in the 2016 election campaign came from this small town called Veles in Macedonia, where this group of fairly sort of entrepreneurial young people were generating stories basically as clickbait in order to generate revenue through advertising online. And I think what that tells us is that I'm not sure if they actually did Donald Trump merchandise as well, but I think what that suggests to us is there is a real economic dimension to this as well. It's not simply about representation, it's actually about the bigger the changing political economy of the media. So in a sense, there is a bigger picture here, and this is the bigger picture. It's what we might call digital capitalism, surveillance capitalism, the changing nature of the media industries. And I think as media educators, we're very used to the idea that we analyse media language, we analyse representation. My argument is that we need to be looking at this bigger picture of how companies like this and how a phenomenon like fake news works economically, how it's being used to generate income. So we need to look not just at media texts, but also at producers and consumers and the broader process. Now, if you're a media educator, in a sense, you know, I'm making an obvious point. That's about our key concepts, and my argument would be that what we are familiar with, the structure of media education, key concepts, absolutely can be applied to fake news or to disinformation as well. Having said that, question 3, how and what do we need to learn about this? I think what we saw in the wake of the first debate around fake news, we had the production of this kind of stuff, kind of checklists, really. Tips to identify fake news, to tell fake from true. I mean, I think I had partly questions about how realistic something like this is. How many people are going to do these kinds of things? How many people are going to check back? You know, how far are people going to check sources and so on in their everyday use of the internet? I'm not sure about that. But I think there's also an assumption often with this, that once we've sorted out what's fake and what's true, then the problem is solved and the problem will go away. In the UK, I think we have a longer history of teaching about this. And just to embarrass Jenny Graham, who's sitting over there, resources like this, media educators in the UK have been teaching about news for a very, very long time. And these kinds of resources produced by the English Media Centre are one example of materials that people have used to teach about news in the context of English teaching and also media studies. And I think, again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We actually have quite a long history. We have an established expertise that we can draw upon. My suggestion for this would be that actually we need to maybe start by teaching about the controversy itself. I'm not sure that fake news is, at the end of the day, a moral panic. I'll leave that to you to think about. Perhaps the whole thing is a hoax. I don't know, but I think a question would be, what's going on in these debates? Who is raising these concerns? How valid are the concerns? How good is the evidence? And I think we really need to be asking questions about who is generating and circulating fake news. How does it influence people? How does the process of making sense of it actually work? We have, this was a YouGov poll, do people think counts as fake news in the first place? People may trust news that confirms their prejudices, even if they know it to be false. Why do people believe what they believe? Why do they trust what they trust? What does trust mean? What does belief mean? I think there are some really complex issues at stake here. And actually one of the things that students need to be doing is asking those questions and having those debates. There's a danger in assuming that the debate goes on somewhere else, and then in the classroom what we're doing is addressing the problem. I think actually students are perfectly capable and competent in engaging in and critiquing these debates themselves. Having said that, there is the question of, who does? Yeah? I think there are issues here when you've been teaching about this to do with how far students are going to be interested, how far they're going to perceive it as relevant to them. Is news in general and this whole area something that teachers like to bang on about, but young people are maybe not interested in? And I think related to that question of interest is the question of knowledge. So how do we make judgments about fake news? Particularly in a context where actually you can argue a lot of young people, but actually a lot of people in general, are not really very interested in news. They don't perceive news to be particularly relevant to them and their everyday lives and their everyday experiences. And they may not know very much about the issues that the news covers. They may not know about the history of what they're seeing, the background to what they're seeing. So I think in that sense, trying to make news and this issue of fake news relevant to people's experience is very difficult. Though I would say that I don't think that's necessarily just a problem for young people. And in fact, there is now research which suggests that actually young people are not the problem. Actually, the problem is older people. So if you look at younger and older people making judgments about fact and opinion in the news, and you have stories like this, older people are more likely to share fake news on Facebook. Perhaps the issue of media literacy is, if not just an issue for young people, but an issue for older people as well, and indeed an issue for politicians. And finally on this, there is the whole issue about how do we make judgments about what's fake and what's real. We can joke about alternative facts, but I think there is a serious issue in the media classroom. Kids don't necessarily accept the superior authority of the teacher. The classroom is another place where a struggle goes on about truth, about whose knowledge counts, about whose knowledge will be accepted. There is a struggle over knowledge that needs to go on, and teaching is about that. So it's complicated. Final question then, is media literacy the solution or the only solution? Again, it's a kind of rhetorical question because my answer is, well, no, not really. I mean, there are various ways in which people have attempted to address the fake news problem as they define it. I mean, the first of those is to look to industry. There's quite a nice sort of cynical response to Facebook's efforts in this area. So what you have is companies employing fact checkers. You know, let's get the algorithms to do it. Let's put ads in the paper, as Facebook has done. Let's put up flags and labels on websites and so on. And I think what's behind this is the idea that somehow there will be a quick fix. There will be an easy solution, and you know, we'll have a series of tips. We'll have an app that will help us to sort out the difference between fake. These are real things, by the way. That we will have some kind of technological solution to the problem, and Mark Zuckerberg will provide it for us. All of this, I think, again, is assuming a simplistic distinction between what's true and what's false. Meanwhile, we have policymakers, we have government. So this was a government report that came out very recently, recommending particularly regulation. They seem to be obsessed with Facebook in particular, but also recommending digital literacy. I think, you know, in a way, the focus here is on regulation of the industry, but regulation is controversial. Regulation is undoubtedly needed, but I think the whole issue of free speech is a really important and serious issue, and I don't think it's going to be easily dealt with in these debates. So what you have is a situation where government is wary of regulation, but is looking to what it calls digital literacy as a way of addressing it. And in fact, that report makes the claim that, oh, well, we're already addressing fake news in the curriculum, so we don't need to do anything about it, which I think is a claim that, as I said, is in itself a form of disinformation. It's a lie. So what we have is, I think, some good examples of people doing media education in this area. But media education is still a pretty marginal area of the school curriculum. Media studies is done by less than 10% of kids. What we really need is media education as a compulsory core curriculum element, but we are a very long way from that. 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk about media literacy, and I would argue that a lot of it has gone nowhere. A lot of it was swallowed up by the in the centre of London, but I think largely failed to make much inroads into the education system. It was a discussion going on among media regulators, but not a discussion that really made very much inroads into education policy. So I guess my answer to my own question would be that media education, media literacy is part of the answer, but the issue here is bigger. It's a systemic issue about the media environment. It's not something that simply individuals should have to deal with. It's something that needs to be addressed at a wider social and political level. I think there is a bigger argument, in a sense, to be made here about digital democracy, about how we can use technology in the public interest, how far do we want our basic means of communication and media to be run by unaccountable private interests. That is a bigger debate, and I guess we're here to talk about fake news, but I would urge us not to lose sight of the bigger picture. That is more than my 15 minutes. As Julian says, I do rant about these things on my blog, so please go and have a look. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to take all the questions in the panel at the end rather than after, if that's okay. So our second speaker is Monica Bulger, who is a senior fellow of the Future of Privacy Forum and an affiliate of the Data and Society Research Institute. And the report by that institute on media literacy really kind of framed this project. So we've started out from some of the recommendations that Monica and her colleagues made in that report. She studies issues of student data privacy, equity, and media literacy. And as well as the report I've just mentioned, the promises, challenges, and futures of media literacy, she recently advised on a 12-part media literacy series as part of the Crash Course series, which you can find on YouTube and we'll be looking at tomorrow as part of the workshop. Monica studied youth practices of digital literacy for UNICEF, the Oxford Internet Institute, Berkman Klein Centre for Internet and Society, Data and Society Research Institute, and the European Commission. Scurry out of the way.
So I'll be actually talking about our brains on fake news and how we practice media literacy in our everyday lives, or don't. So first what I'd like to know is, when was the last time you checked your phones? Seconds? Minutes? Are you on it right now? How long can you go without checking your phone? I was checking mine during David's presentation, but I was tweeting, of course, and that's something I wanted to say. Maybe you're thinking right now, well, I was tweeting. Well, I was looking up something David mentioned because I was so engaged. Or I have life events going on, guys. I can't not check my phone. Whatever it is, we're checking our phone a lot. So I want to ask you, and this is not something to answer out loud unless you want to, but do you check your phone before you go to sleep?
Yeah.
Do you check your phone as soon as you wake up?
Yeah.
Do you check it in between?
Yeah.
I'm yes to all of those, and probably most of you are too. This isn't a talk about internet addiction. It's about the intensely personal and pervasive relationship we have with tech. We are saturated by media. It's part of our everyday life. And so when we're talking about media literacy, I don't think turning it off is an option, and I don't think that being constantly skeptical is an option. Because when we think of media literacy, traditionally, we were thinking of a relationship with media that we started at some point and ended at some point. But now that we're completely saturated, to be skeptical at every moment of this thing, this precious that we carry with us everywhere, that has our entire lives on, our work lives, our personal lives, our friends, our family, our colleagues. When we start to think about being constantly skeptical of that, we're getting into mental health issues, right? Because we start to be paranoid. We would, if we have to question every single thing we're doing all day long, that's not healthy for us. And that might be a reason why we're so stressed and anxious all the time, is because we're getting all of this information and we don't know how to process it. It's beyond our computational powers to be able to do so. And so, so I want to investigate that a little bit. I want to talk about how tech knows this, how tech developers know this about us, how our minds are exploited, and what we might be able to do about it. I'm going to put my phone down now. Anyways, sorry, that's just a joke for me. So my question is media literacy even a possibility anymore? So I'm reading this really interesting book, and I highly recommend it. James Williams, who's at the Oxford Internet Institute and the winner of the 9 Thoughts Prize, wrote a book called Stand Out of Our Light. It's a thin book, but I would say a transformational read. So I highly recommend it. He worked for Google, and one of his early questions in it is, do tech goals equal human goals? So what tech developers want out of our use is not the same as what we want out of our use. He asks the question, think about goals you have for yourself. Think about goals you had for today or for tonight. Hopefully you came here hoping to get something out of it, right? You have some sort of goal for your evening. But the tech goals are different. What the tech wants you to do is stay on their platforms for as long as possible. They want you to invite friends. They want you to have followers. They want you to get those likes and to be disseminating information, because the longer we're on their systems, the more economically beneficial we are. So our goals and technology's goals are in conflict. So keeping us on the platform equals success. Sharing equals success. You might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As humans, we crave love and belonging, right? So those likes, we like those. We love being loved. We love having a certain number of friends, a certain number of thumbs up, a certain number of hearts. We love to be retweeted. We love to have followers. We crave recognition and esteem. And these are not weaknesses, these are how we are wired. And tech knows this. It's designed to exploit these needs so that our human needs serve company interests. This is known as the psychology of attention. And many of you in the room might be familiar with persuasive technologies, but for those of you who aren't, the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab trained several of the leading developers of these projects. They would have a class on how to keep people on your platforms, and they would learn how to exploit what our brains need in order to stay online. And so they would encourage people to keep scrolling, to return tomorrow, to involve our friends, to hook us into a project so we're there as much as possible. So when things say like, you've been online you've been on this app consistently for however many days, that's a way of keeping you on. So a whole set of alumni from Stanford went on to use these principles to attract and hold people's attention. The basic formula is motivation plus ability plus a well-timed trigger. I'd like you to just think for a second what your triggers are. I like seeing the likes. I like getting pinged that somebody's looking at something or somebody's commented on it. We're at the point now when we go somewhere and we see a beautiful picture of something, we're thinking how it's going to look in landscape mode, or we're thinking about filming it or commenting on it. We're thinking of how to put ourselves into it so that it becomes something engaging for other people. Social acceptance or rejection are powerful motivators, and well-timed triggers keep us on the page. What's really critical here to understand is that these devices are teaching us to make tech goals our goals. Whenever your phone pings or buzzes or does a banner at you, it's training you in responding to it. You're becoming part of their system rather than you driving it. A really great example that Williams says in his book is imagine a GPS system where you put in the location you're supposed to go to, and the first time you get there. But the second time it takes you somewhere else, and you think, okay, well, it was off this one time. The third time it takes you somewhere entirely different. You would think that the GPS system was faulty, right? But how many times do you start an app or go online, and you end up somewhere completely different than you planned to at first? You've lost time, and you don't even remember sometimes why you started or where you meant to go. And we're not saying that that's faulty, right? Why? Why aren't we saying that's faulty? We're being trained. It's training us. And because it's giving us what we like. We like junk information. Our brains love that, and I'm going to get to that next. So before I move on to that, I'd like you to think about this in terms of attention versus intention. What they've captured of ours is attention. And one thing that's critical for us to survive this landscape is to start thinking in terms of intention. And that's a provocation to talk about later. But let's talk about our brains. So our minds love to automate processes. You probably don't pay attention when you brush your teeth. You probably don't pay attention when you drive or when you walk the same path. You might not even be paying attention now, no. You might not pay attention when you're typing, you're not thinking of your fingers, right? All of that is automating our brain, our processes. And the reason our brains do that is because cognitive load. If we had to think about every single thing we were doing, like I'm breathing now, I'm stepping now, my screen just, but it's up there, so we'll just keep going. Everything else I'm going to say. If we have to think about every single thing we're doing, we'd go crazy. We'd trip over our own feet. Who knows what we would do when we're brushing our teeth if we had to think of every single thing. And if you've ever moved, that's a really good example. That morning after you move or you're staying somewhere else and you can't find anything, your processes aren't automated. It's crazy making, right? And that's what our brains try to do. They try to make that process easier. We also have what's known as schema, which are models for understanding things. This automates the processes too. So we have models for the restaurants we like to choose. We have models for, okay, I trust this restaurant. I trust this food grocery chain. I trust this information source, right? These are models to help us understand things and make life easier. We also do this incredible sense-making process where even when something doesn't make sense, even when there's gaps in information, our brains fill those. Because having something not connected isn't automatic, right? It nibbles at us. It's something we can't get rid of in our head. So the brain has this immense capacity for sense-making. why that works against us in a complex media environment is, first of all, false memory. So the best example of this is when several people witness a car accident. You ask people what happened, and people are going to remember a red car was blue. They're going to remember that the driver was coming from a different direction. But if they hear it from somebody else, or somebody hears them saying it wrong, they're going to remember it that way too. And on it goes. An example, probably an example you're all familiar with is when you first heard about swans, and somebody knew somebody whose arm had been broken by a swan, right? Like, everybody knows somebody within a few connections, right? But BBC Earth says very few people have had, if anybody, has had their arm broken by a swan. I hate to break it to you in case you've been careful all these years. I mean, they are pretty intimidating, so maybe caution is well deserved. But anyways, you have that memory in your mind. You picture that a swan has broken somebody's arm that you might know well. Confirmation bias. Our brains are trying to automate everything, and so when we see information that agrees with us, we believe it. We gravitate toward it. So this is especially difficult when an algorithm's feeding us information that we've already shown that we like, because we're just going to be fed the same information. A preference for stories. We love neatly packaged things. So uncertainty, complexity, that's not what our brains love. Our brains don't want to work that hard. So it's going to go for the easy answer, which isn't necessarily the best answer or the most useful way to process information. And finally, our brains like exceptions, the fun stuff, the outrage, the drama. Our brains are drawn to that. So you can imagine that false news, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it, YouTube channels with Kardashians, all of that stuff, like, our brains are just loving that. But it's not necessarily good for us. Same way you love junk food, and it's not necessarily good for you. So applying what we know about how our minds work, it's clear that the current news cycles are using the psychology of attention to keep us engaged, as well as our need for simplicity to focus narrative. So it looks like many people in this room will remember the heady early days of the internet, when there was so much promise. It was the democratization of information. I wrote about that. It was so exciting to think that everyone could have a voice, right? That everyone could have a megaphone. And during Arab Spring, it seemed incredibly promising. People were posting events, and it seemed like, oh, we're going to change the world through democratizing information. The problem is, everything's democratized. So we're ending up with a lot of junk. We're ending up with a lot of influencers and bloggers, and we've lost the gatekeepers. We've lost those who are vetting. I'm putting these pictures up because just on my cab ride over here, the driver was telling me about his 9-year-old daughter who's been following JoJo Siwa for 3 years. So she's following a young kid for 3 years, and he doesn't watch it. And he's like, I don't really know. I mean, she's sponsored. She gets a lot of toys, and you know, it doesn't seem very harmful. And then I talked to other people, and their kids are following gamers. Other people are, you know, the kids are understanding these influencers much better than we are. I don't have time really to follow people on YouTube, but maybe I should be to figure out who's being followed and why. But we don't have time. Nobody does really have time, right, to be watching what kind of information is going out and influencing. But you look at these numbers, that's 30,000, but a lot of these have millions, and so they have a voice and they have an impact. And this is media. So we have the loss of gatekeepers. What's strange for me is that kids now won't even remember the days when like news was on at a certain time, and everybody knew the names of the news anchors, right? And that's good and bad, right? None of this is completely bad or completely good. There's the trade-offs, but we don't have trusted sources anymore telling us many times more, but vetting for us information. So when there is an event, we don't really know who we should trust. I live in California, and I was part of the wildfires last year, and it was so incredible to me the misinformation that was being published by the news about like where evacuations were happening, where they weren't happening, how fast the fire was spreading. The most reliable source of news for us was our work Slack channel, where local people were sharing what was happening in their neighborhoods and providing the Twitter feed for the local fire department and providing information for the local news. Those were our best sources of information. We have a distrust of traditional news corresponding with the rise of influencers, which I just spoke about. And then we have this equating of expertise with elitism, and so that therefore a dismissal. And that's why I really love this New Yorker cartoon. I don't know if you've seen it before, but these smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane? Right? Everybody raises their hand. Then what? So how can media literacy help? This is an old quote, but one of the painful things about our times is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. What I'd like to say about this is that people who have doubt and indecision are perceived as stupid, right? Like when you're on a news channel and you're not barking out exactitudes, I don't know if that's a word, but fake news, I just created one at this time. If you're not barking out certainties, then you're considered uncertain and therefore not an expert or unsure. We're trusting the people who sound certain who may not be good sources of information. Okay, so how can media literacy help? I think we need to reconceptualize from the notion of scarcity of media to a notion of abundance. And by that I mean saturation. We need to consider that media is always on and it's constant. So how do we negotiate this world? How do we mediate this world? The first thing is to pause, because this world wants us clicking. This world wants us liking. This world wants us sharing immediately. And even as academics, because everyone I talk to that has told me that they find this true, we are retweeting things we are not reading. We need to be reading. We need to be vetting, because nobody else is. And this room is filled with experts. So pause. When there's a news cycle that you're unsure of, pause and wait to see how it evolves over a day. If you're not sure about whether to share it or not. A good example is the recent Momo hoax. People were sharing that very quickly before it was verified to be true. Know yourself. So I hate to break it to you, but no one in this room is perfect at vetting information, right? As expert as we are, we all have our biases. All of our brains are working the same way. All of our brains are working the same way. We are all wired the same on that level. So what are your biases? For example, yesterday on Twitter, somebody said that Trump's new budget plan was going to take lunches away from school children. That is my red meat issue. I was, oh! And immediately I go online to start reading about it, just another thing he's doing, you know? That's my red meat issue. My bias is that I don't like Trump. Sorry to our funders. Those are my biases and those are my red meat issues. So the minute I see something like that, I react. Please know your red meat issues and be aware of when they're happening, because if fake news exists, since David questioned whether it does, but those folks creating the potentially non-existent fake news know our brains really well and know very well how to persuade us. In fact, in a study Data and Society conducted on influencers and also on those creating memes and other misinformation and disinformation, we uncovered in I believe it was a Reddit post, but it might have been elsewhere, links to all of the psychological manipulation work from advertising in the 50s and 60s. Like, here's how you do it. Here's how you manipulate. So they definitely, they're well trained and they know how to get to our brains. Interrogate your sources starting out. Like, when you decide to start following somebody, look at who they are on Twitter. Like, who are they? Where do they come from? Who's following them? Why are you choosing to trust them? Who are you trusting that's trusting them? And update that based on new information. Because then it's okay if your brain, then when your brain automates it's not as dubious and it's not as stressful. Here's a crazy one, number 4, don't trust your gut instinct. So you might not be aware of this, but research from Norbert Schwartz's lab at USC has found that when we're presented with false information, we might be skeptical the first time, we might not be. When we're presented that information was most definitely false. So for example, are you familiar with the Momo hoax? The Momo hoax is this, okay, everybody's nodding, so I'll just keep going. We're presented with that that's a hoax, right? The next time we see it, like a few weeks later, we might not remember it's a hoax. What our brains will remember is that it's familiar, and we trust familiar. So that's why our gut instinct isn't necessarily the best source, and everybody trusts their gut. So this is something we have to work against. The only way we question it is if something triggers suspicion, which is hard to do when it's familiar and your gut's trusting it. The other thing is to create rails, and figure out what those are for yourself. Maybe it's shut off times, like at dinner nobody's checking their phones, or whatever that is. Like I said, we're all checking them at night, we're checking them in the morning. Maybe we're not checking them between when we go to sleep and when we officially wake up. News fast, take the weekend off, social media fast, that kind of thing. We're going to be discussing toolkits at the workshop, but what the message there is that you are in control. We need to be mindful of how we're using it. We need to practice attention versus intention. For platforms, and this is my last point, be aware of what's not visible. So when you do a search on Google, you don't know what that whole purpose is. When we used to do research in the library, you knew what that purpose was. So you don't know what's being excluded. What you also don't know in terms of visibility is how that information is being served to you and why. So for example, in the past week, Facebook took down an article about Elizabeth Warren saying, criticizing Facebook. It got taken down. So it got, of course, attention was drawn to it. So then it was reshared. But the point is that we don't know what the platforms are manipulating to protect the platforms. And what we also don't know, and this is a very good point to understand, algorithms are trained on you. They're not trained on your well-being. They're trained on what you're going to keep looking at. So that's like a vending machine just serving you junk food and whatever junk food you like, whatever your struggle is, salty, sweet, whatever it is, it's going to keep serving that to you, even though it makes you sick, even though it's not good for your well-being, because the immediate gratification keeps you on the app. Recommended further reading is the book I said, and I'm at Literacy Online if you'd like to get in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. One of the absurd things about my existence is I spend my time inviting great people to fly a long way to talk and then stand up and say, 2 minutes. Stop talking. Yes. I should probably change that. Thank you very much. So our third and last but not least speaker is Paul Michaelidis, who is Associate Professor of Civic Media and Journalism at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, where he leads an MA in Civic Media Art and Practice. He's also Principal Investigator at the Emerson Engagement Lab and Director of the Salzburg Academy on Media and Global Change. And he's written that book, which is what I was about to say. He's the author of that book. And he's also, I'm delighted to say, a visiting professor with us in Kent, Bournemouth University.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting on this event, and thanks for making me go behind these guys. I really appreciate that. I hope what I can spend the next 15 minutes doing. So I actually think, I know we spent weeks planning the synergy between our talks, and what I hope to do is actually, it seems to be aligning nice to go from kind of some of the contemporary problems to looking at more of the cognitive issues around it. And what I'm going to speak today is some of the structural constraints that I see happening within digital culture that are changing the relationship that that people have to news and information, and then offer a few approaches that we might consider around this idea of civic media or civic intentionality, where the monarchy is. And this is a book that came out at the end of last year, and so these ideas will be quite These ideas are very short and compact versions of what's a longer argument embedded in the book. Really boring, but long. So this book starts off with kind of one thing that has caught me, that caught my attention. Two things, actually. The first is this idea that Michael Bugeja, in this book, Interpersonal Divide, The Age of the Machine, writes that in this age of ubiquitous media, we struggle with the rigors of the human condition. And I think we've heard a lot about that tonight. We kind of struggle with things that we are cognitively wired to do, and the design of these now kind of large and immersive, ubiquitous media platforms that are taking advantage of those rigors. And perhaps within that space, you see some issues. And then the second part, which David mentioned earlier, was this idea that media literacy is a responsive source, that we see it as some form of solutionism, which is also somewhat fraught and challenging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see, two things that I argue about emerging norms within digital culture that are contributing to what I agree with is a struggle, and then what that results in. And so the first one is this notion of, this notion of spectacle. So spectacle is not a new concept. It's been around. Guy Debord developed this primarily critical theorist in the mid-20th century, talking about the role of images and representation that guides the relationship with people. I've been looking at this quite closely in the last few years around the role of these large-scale digital and social platforms, polarized spaces where people are more and more subject to personalized information design and extraction, sensational content, sophisticated advertising techniques. And so where I think this, these should all not be, this is my most creative slide of the evening. If I'm the part, that these, and I think it's not, this used to be, I don't think it's a surprise to us anymore that we've seen research over and over again now to substantiate the design, the inherent design within these platforms and networks, that they are focused on, as you said, they're focused on the extraction of data, they're focused on the continuing use, the sharing and repurposing of expression. Their currency is our time, their currency is our effort. And we've kind of hit this tipping point where what they've realized is the type of content and behaviors that keep us engaged in them are things that we just heard from Monica. So content that's more sensational, that's more shareable, that's more personable, that has these redeeming values. And it's not, and they've designed it this way. And my argument around this is that these platforms have done exactly what they should do in the marketplace of like commodified systems, and that our news and our civic and public institutions have opted into these because they're so good at gathering the human attention of their users. And so what we have seen is this conflation of, this is kind of one example that leads it off, but there are more. What they've bred is a space where when people figure out their design, like early examples from David talking about like the young Macedonian entrepreneurs that learn how to manipulate the system to achieve commercial ends. And when news organizations and civic organizations play in that role, you get someone like our friend Pepe the Frog, who becomes co-opted by alternative groups that know how to use these platforms that do not distinguish between real news and other forms of news. At least they didn't have that effort, 2, 3, 4 years ago when this all started. And then you see mainstream politicians who also co-opt these, right? But what's more interesting now is not simply this example, but two recent pieces that have been out in the last few days, one by Arthur Brooks. He wrote, "The contemporary society does not have a problem with civility," which I don't agree with. It does, but he thinks the problem is rather a problem with contempt. And he says that the design of these systems are not just breeding like general incivilities; they're breeding contempt for the other, because he says contempt makes political compromise and progress impossible. It also makes us unhappy as people. So if deep inside we're all unhappy, we can blame it on these technologies. So I think this is really compelling to me, that we think about civility and this notion of contempt. And in our platforms that are designed for continual engagement and distraction and sensational and spectacular content, asking people to continually move through them, share them, express, respond, these kind of rigors of the human condition, liking, feeling good about ourselves, they create contempt. So the next set of examples around spectacle, these aren't this is in the US, this is now, I don't know how many months ago for those who remember it. This was on the Nation, the Capitol, in front of the Capitol. It was a group from Kentucky and a Native American group protesting for their rights that clashed, and it was caught on camera and shared. Now, the interesting thing is that these platforms, when they ask users and they put them in peer groups, self-supported peer groups, to advocate for these, the users take control. And normally, as we've all seen anecdotally, contempt is what comes out of that. Same thing here. This was in the US Supreme Court hearing, if no one remembers. I'm based in Boston. I didn't introduce myself. It's completely rude of me. But I am based in Boston, so these examples come from my perspective. This is Brett Kavanaugh, who was a recently elected US Supreme Court Justice, and his hearing with the one who accused him of sexual assault some 30 or 40 years ago. And it's not that this issue, it's that when this issue gets co-opted into these platforms that prioritize spectacle, what you have emerging is this culture of people sharing in like-minded networks, ideas, opinions, inferences, and they get conflated in our news cycle. Mainstream media, as David said, is just as complicit in this because they know in this privatized system that to find more eyeballs and more connection with their users, they have to opt into these spaces as well. So they're just as complicit in sharing and spreading some of this news. This is the caravan, the migrant caravan that started out in Central and South America, another space where contempt breeds, right? So the spectacle argue ends with Wael Ghonim, who is one of the kind of anonymous Facebook founders in the MENA uprisings in the Arab Spring. He recently had a talk where he put together a series of kind of generalities that I think map nicely with spectacle. We don't know how to deal with rumors. We tend to only communicate with people that we agree with. Online discussions quickly descend into angry mobs. We're forced to jump to conclusions. And our digital experiences favor broadcasting over engagement, posts over discussions, and shallow commitments over deep interactions. And he's talking about like our online realities. And so basically I'm arguing that the first problem is one of these platforms that prioritize us being with people that are like-minded, that share values and views, beliefs. We feel justified in peer validation of what we share or in validating peers and getting that feedback. Again, that's part of the human condition. So out of spectacle, the second problem that I'll put forward to us to consider tonight and tomorrow is this notion of trust and distrust. And we've heard this from a few people. A crisis of trust has been evolving for decades, but animated now by alternative media and politicians who openly question the basic functions of our public institutions. So public institutions have always had a complicated relationship with trust. There aren't many that have had like wonderful, trustful relationships with the public. Governments are notoriously difficult. They're doing the hard and complicated work. They work out of deficit models. Media is often the same way. A study that came out in 2017 showed that the distrust in our public institutions is greater than it's ever been, and media is greater than any other government, business, or NGOs. The trust levels are falling. So if we ask ourselves why, there's a myriad of reasons. They're probably all quite complicated and complex. I would say that one of the largest spaces of our emerging norms of digital culture, again, these spaces that are designed, that we all opt into, that we're all complicit in, as we heard from our future speakers, that they're just designed to actually sustain and spread and promote this level of distrust, because we don't ever really have to do the hard work of engaging with our institutions, right? In a culture of contempt, we can quickly shut them down or shut them off, feel validated by our peers, and not do that hard work. So Penn State professor S. Shyam Sundar, whose work is really interesting to me, he kind of is in the middle of cognitive psychology and communication. He's been doing 10 years, over a decade of research around like online readership and news. And he continually finds through his research that like he has this principle of layers, that it's really complicated, that online readers, first of all, judging credibility is not the primary motive. They much more care about, they don't really care about the importance of journalistic sources, although I agree with David that it's not that they don't know how to source, but it's that they're more interested in information that confirms their values than they are information otherwise. Again, so when you have platforms that prioritize this, it's quite easier to say that doesn't agree, I don't agree with that, so therefore trust is going away, right? Another large study by, we've heard this, the human condition again, a large study by MIT researchers that just happened to get millions and millions of dollars to do this work, found that by every common metric, falsehood consistently dominates the truth on Twitter. False rumors reach more people, penetrate deeper into the social network, and spread much faster than accurate stories. I don't need to talk about why, because I think Monica just did a great job at talking about all of the reasons why this is true. But for me, the bigger question, like this is actually, this is actually a really awesome, like the most viewed fake news stories from 2017. And if you open it, to me, it's like a fascinating fabric of some that are like wildly absurd to some that are just a little bit off. And it's really interesting when you dive into this network, like the fabric of fakeness, to see where the spectrum lies. And to see how it's all based kind of in the idea of us preferencing our implicit and innate values. This is a nice graph around pizza. We don't have to talk about it, but this is like the idea about distrust culminating to the point where entire alternative subgroups can build narratives that are so powerful around false and misleading information that they actually get picked up by all of the mainstream media, legitimated, spread, sustained, and lead to some physical outcome, right? So this happened in Washington, D.C. in 2016 when a group uncovered through WikiLeaks documents the child sex harboring ring in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that was led by the Democratic Party members. And this is actually the New York Times who did a story that I think it got like 300,000 or 400,000 reads, and then the same alternative group that has been doing it put out a response video debunking the New York Times story, which got twice as many views and reads as the actual New York Times story. So you see the pervasiveness. Okay, so where is this all going for me? Julian, how are we doing, okay? This is kind of the...
Slightly lost track, I reckon you got 3 to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You're not supposed to lose track. So, my recommendations, and again, this is what I hope that will give us points for conversation tonight, including what my colleagues have said, but also help for those of you who are participating tomorrow. Give us some foundation or some kind of some things to think about for what we're going to try to work on tomorrow. I write that like this is what I consider spectacle and distrust. They've created a I can just play this quickly. I added this just now, so it's like only a minute, and I'll show it to you. They have created a space where, and Monica said this, so this is, I'll tell you what this is in a minute for. This is done by a doctoral student at Penn State, who mapped every protest using like GDELT data. So he mapped every protest that was covered and talked about, like every civic involvement protest that was mapped or talked about in the world from 1979 to 2014. And I think this, to me, it's a convenient way of like reinforcing the thing that I'm talking about this culture when our news and information systems exist in spaces that prioritize our sharing, our rage, the spectacle, the thing that we care about, that culture of contempt. And you can see what happens in this document, that our responses necessarily need to be in that space and not only can we give more critical skills. So if you see what's happening here, this is the late 90s. So again, this is all the protest civic activism that are happening. So you see in the world, so it seems like Latin America is pretty calm. 2001, this is when laptops are emerging, Google is coming home. 2003, this is when social networks are born. That's Facebook is born. Now we have YouTube and Twitter. And you could think the world is maybe falling apart or we're getting more awful. Now you have mobile phones come into play here. Oh wait, this is when iPhones and smartphones become ubiquitous. You could think that the world is falling apart at this point, or that we're all falling into it. But really, I think what's happening, and then 11, 12, now the whole world is dying. And there's nothing we can do because everyone is upset about everything, right? So, and it's a great video, and if I share this presentation with you, you can find it. We're not going to watch it again. Sorry. And so here we go. So what I think is like what I have been calling, this is just not really what I'm calling, but I'm calling it tonight, so in case they can spur some conversation, is media literacy's civic problem. So as media literacy's evolved, again, I'm not going to make claims for what media literacy is or generalize it to everybody and everything, but I really think that in light of the argument I'm making around the norms of digital culture today, that I think that we've lost this sense, we've been focusing again on like the skills and the dispositions people need to effectively like understand it. This is it. I'm right on time.
Back on track now.
Yeah, thank you, buddy. And this is from a great book called The Knowledge Illusion, which I also like. I didn't have a nice picture of it like you did as recommended reading, but I recommend it. And they talk about like this idea about learning alone and how detrimental it is to our society. And he talks about machines are intelligent enough that we rely on them as a central part of our community knowledge, yet no machine has that singular ability so central to human activity. No machine can share intentionality. So what I'm arguing is that media literacies have that these processes that we've stuck with quite often, access, analysis, creation, reflection, action, critical consumption, they're still valuable across formal school, informal spaces, primary, secondary, lifelong skills, but that to re-engage in our communities takes a set of values that we don't often talk about enough. Things like caring and imagination and emancipation, critical consciousness and persistence. And these are some of the values that I think we need to think more about in our design of interventions that are going to try to push back against, they might involve regulations, they might involve more like this idea about just finding ways to connect as humans again. And then I will leave this here with no further explanation because I'm out of time. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.